building success through stories. This is going to be, I'd say, episode 1 out of 6, as we kind of take you on a journey of storytelling for luxury brands, why that's important, how you can make the most of your stories, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty into the later episodes in terms of how you then implement that into your digital strategy, how to report, and most importantly for some, how to get your C-suite on board with investing more in storytelling. So that's kind of what's to come in these future episodes. But for now, we're going to start off with the big question, which is the why. If you've not been to one of our webinars before, there's just a little bit of housekeeping. So if we have time to answer any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll either address them as the webinar goes on, or we'll just come back to you offline once we're finished. And as usual, these will be made available on demand after the session has ended. So if you do have to dip out halfway through, don't panic. I'll follow up with everybody with recordings. So don't panic. I'm joined as usual by Andy, and he's actually going to get us started in this first webinar on why luxury brands should be using stories to win new customers. So over to you, Andy.
Yeah, morning everyone. So the real fabric of our agency is what surrounds this one phrase really, which is in order to scale, in order to grow, you really can't sell more to the same. You have to transition to finding strategies that sell more to new. So often when we talk to new clients and even existing clients, and we get to the next revenue ceiling and then we want to push to the next one and the next one, often the conversations that we have surround new channels, sometimes new territories across the world. But primarily within those, how do we go after people that may have never heard about our brand before and don't know what we stand for? And that's really the biggest pot to go and fish in when you're looking to get from 2 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20 and beyond. So if you just whiz to the next slide there for me, Danielle. So a question to ask ourselves really is, how do we do that? Well, if we look at some of the most successful brands, so here we've got Nike, Gymshark and Apple, these symbols are not brands. They're logos. The difference between a logo and a brand is the story that is created that makes people remember. People don't necessarily remember logos, they remember the stories behind them. So Nike, for example, Just Do It. They support runners right through grassroots, through to athletes. And the whole mantra is, look, just take that first step, just do it, we're there to support you. Again, doesn't mention product. Gymshark set up in gyms. So their first marketing tactic was one of community building. So they went down to local gyms, they put sessions on, they gave advice, they gave everything away and built their story around supporting excellence in gyms. Apple is another great example where their whole mantra is, we don't make computers in boxes. We actually make computers in boxes that help and fuel the creators of our world and the future brains of our world. We just happen to be the function of allowing them to go and do and be the best people and do the best work that they can. So all of those three things simplified down differentiate those, the picture of an apple, an arrow that looks like it's moving quickly, and a swoosh tick. That is the differentiator, is how they set themselves apart, which is the interesting point on that, through a story. In terms of the next slide, is really a summing up of that. It is attracting new customers, which, as I mentioned already, is the biggest pot of people that we can target, and keeping their attention is all about how you communicate why you're different, and the easiest way to deliver that is through a story. So what is an example of that? So Disney, for example, most people think it's just, a fantastic telling of stories over, 100 plus years. And that would be true, but actually there's a system and a process. And over the course of these, the next 6 months, so these 6 webinars, as Danielle mentioned, we're going to try and give you some sort of guidance, and there'll be some freebies at the end of each of the upcoming webinars to help you start to reassess. If you believe you've got a good strategy and you've got a good story to tell, then follow the guides in these next 5 webinars when we come to them, and it'll help you just check that. Either create one or check what the story that you're running with, and is it different than just having a symbol on above the door when you go into your store, for example. But if we look at the storytelling framework from Disney, there's 7 key stages. So every time they go into a storytelling, and if you think about, any right away back from the earlier ones of, Beauty and the Beast through to the more modern ones, there's always 7 key stages to the work. And actually, it's not dissimilar to most of the plays and most of the films that we watch today, going back hundreds of years. Danielle, you're the actor amongst us, so you know more about the 7 secret stages to filmmaking than me. But you can list them as I have here. So typically, the first stage is that there's a character. So you can think probably about this as your brand or your company. There's a problem there, and you have to then introduce a solution or a guide. So Disney does this really well. So they have a baddie, and they have a goodie, and that's all people think, that there's just the bad versus the good always win, job done. But how that narrative is constructed around those 2 characters is actually what makes the story, not that you have a brand or not that you've got a good or a bad character. So the good character, in this case, the hero, has a problem, stage 2. Stage 3 is the transition between somebody wandering around with a problem and then meeting a guide who then gives them a plan, calls them to action, so gives them a plan. This is the promised land over this way, and helps them avoid potential defeat, which is where the good versus evil always wins, despite evil or the baddie trying to deter things, and then delivers the hero to success. That process can be translated into how you structure your storytelling for your brand. Often brands talk about themselves. The 3 brands we looked at there talked about themselves second, or even third, or even don't mention themselves at all. It's all about how do we help that customer, in this case, understand who we are and why we're different. So by outlining why we're different and what the problem we overcome for the customer is it comfort, is it style, does it set them aside from everybody else? Is it a unique product that when they walk down the restaurant, find the table, everyone's looking, going, wow, I've never seen that dress before, or what are those shoes, or love that piece of jewelry. It's all about how does the product that you sell provide, so meet the guide and provide a plan, which in your case is the product you sell delivers something to that customer that they're not already feeling with another similar product. So that's going to be the key that we'll get into a bit of detail of, but that's going to be the key. What does your product do different? So essentially have your customer at the center of the marketing communication and the storytelling, not your brand. Your brand comes further down the line once you give them a plan, and the plan happens to be your product. Okay, there's a problem here. You go into dinner, you don't have something to wear. We have a solution. It's going to make you look and feel amazing. Listen to our story and we'll tell you why and how. And by the way, the dress is £1,000. Okay, so if you take people through that point, and the reason I mentioned the high order value there is because we work mostly in the luxury space, and often brands that get to a growth ceiling that have high order values get to that point and can't get beyond it because they don't play the role of the guide, and they don't give their customers a reason why it's £1,000 or £1,500 for a suitcase. What they need to know that why. Just because we're working with high net worth individuals doesn't mean that they just throw money around left, right, and centre. Actually, quite the opposite in some cases. Of if you studied high net worth individuals and how they operate, they've got to that point because they're very clever and with their money particularly. So it's not just a case of we're targeting high net worth. They're resistant to global downturns on finance, and because they've got lots of cash. It's not quite as simple as that. There's a much more nuanced way that high net worth individuals buy, and they buy by feeling that you're giving them something special. That plan is different to what they've heard of before, which essentially is your story. Okay, next slide, please, Danielle. So really, your brand story is unique. So I'll pass back to you, Danielle, now, just to sort of tell us a bit about the differentiation of brands.
Yeah, so I think as a very sweeping generalization, the e-commerce market is kind of more competitive than it's ever been as more and more brands start to be established. But also specifically for luxury, we're seeing far more luxury / premium players in the mix that sit outside of kind of the top 10 fashion houses. There are a lot more kind of niche, boutique, luxury, premium brands that are starting to rise up through the mix that have been born out of D2C and born out of e-commerce. It then becomes very tricky to try and get new customers out of that initial kind of excitement period when a brand launches. So when a brand launches, people will obviously put a lot of time and effort into brand awareness, making sure that people know who you are. And that can fade quite quickly if you don't have a long-term plan in place. And because the market is so competitive, your brand needs to be able to stand out amongst a sea of opinions and conversations and content that we're seeing from every brand that exists on the internet. And it's the easiest way of differentiating your brand is to find that brand story that is unique to you. And that could be anything from why the brand even started in the first place. So those kind of founder-led stories of, you know, somebody noticing a gap in the market because they had a problem that couldn't be solved. So they went and solved it themselves. I know that Primark is not a luxury brand at all. However, they've seen a gap in the market for accessible clothing for disabled people and people that have mobility issues, and they've taken that now, and they've, as of today, they have launched that clothing range with accessible zips and different fastenings. You know, so they noticed a gap in the market and they took it. So that could be one way. It could, you know, be to do with your heritage or your culture, something that's really unique to you that only you can talk about. There's so many different things that you can lean on, and it saves you talking about fabric and manufacturing and product, which there's bound to be another brand that does a very similar thing to you in that space. You know, people talk about comfort and style, and that's great, but it's also quite generic, and it's something that thousands of other brands are also talking about. So how can you make that yours? And it's the easiest way to be able to stand out and start talking about something that's a little bit more unique.
And in almost every case that we've helped people with this, almost every case, it's already in the business, isn't it? The story's there.
Yeah, it's most of the time it's hidden somewhere in up the top, as I would say. You know, it's there, and it just might not have filtered down through all of the different departments. Or if, you know, it's a brand that's been going for 25, 30 years, it might have just got a bit lost in kind of the sea that is digital marketing in terms of, you know, always talking about product and always having bottom of funnel because that's what drives revenue and that's what drives ROAS. But actually you've lost like the essence of why the brand is there in the first place. So I think it's important that we find out what that is again and start talking to people outside of the marketing department in the business. You know, there might be somebody that's worked in customer services for 10, 15 years that knows the brand better than anybody else. So I think that's a really important thing to think about, that it sits outside of marketing as well as, you know, in that kind of small little team. And investing in brand building and your story is hands down going to be more profitable than you think. People think that brand building is a waste of money. They think that upper funnel is a waste because it's those bottom of funnel shopping ads that is driving revenue. And I use this analogy a lot, but if you've fished all the fish out of your pond, who's pouring more fish in the pond? And that's a very kind of basic way of looking at it. But if you think about your current customers or your current audience being fish in a pond and you're using bottom of funnel ads to fish them all, what do you do when the pond is empty? So actually investing in brand building and brand awareness and making sure that your story is available for new audiences means that more people are going to be swimming in your pond and there are more people to fish. Investing in brand building has a knock-on effect to the effectiveness of the rest of your marketing strategy. It's a debate that's been ongoing for years, and there is evidence that brands who don't invest in storytelling or that brand building piece will often see success in the short term, but not in the long term. So if you're a brand that wants to be here for a while, it's something that people need to be thinking about. Yes, Andy.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in there. It's particularly important with luxury brands as well, because the lower order value on sort of general retail e-commerce brands, if you're a customer and it's 10, 15, 20 pounds, the chance of you going, go on, I don't really understand why, but I'm just going to impulse and buy because I quite like that type of thing. That doesn't really happen, irrespective of high net worth individuals or not, when it's 5, 6, 7, even 100 to 300 pound order values. So it was just to make a comment to suggest that lots of brands come to us and say, oh yeah, we're doing 500,000 or we're doing £1 million and we want to really grow from here. But they've done it because they've laterally got moved into lots of channels. They're on TikTok, they're on Pinterest, they're on Google Ads, they're on Microsoft Ads, they're on the Meta, they're on all of these channels. And what they've done is that they've made some progress up to a reasonable level by just being visible. And they get to these growth ceilings, and how you get beyond them is kind of what we're trying to tell you in the next 6 months.
Great. So this is a really interesting chart. Magic Numbers has some really great data on e-commerce marketing and kind of brand building in general. So if you're after data in that realm, it's a really good company to follow and to keep on top of. This chart shows that on average, brands are wasting £10 million by running boring ads. Now, boring is a very subjective term. In this case, what constitutes as boring is not necessarily outlined. However, I can hazard a guess that it's going to be, product shot, e-com shot, talking about product, none of that kind of more exciting, emotionally driven brand activation that we love. So you need to start making your ads a little bit more memorable, especially when you look at retail as an industry. In this particular chart, it sits above average at 17.8 million. And the number behind that and the way that it works is because for quote unquote a dull ad to be as effective as what they've cited as a less dull ad, you have to spend, in this case, 17.8 million more to drive the same level of business success. So that's a huge amount of money. Now, this is all averaged out, and it's averaged across a wealth of different brands who are turning over a different amount. So that's not going to be the same for every brand, because some brands don't have 10 mil to spend on advertising. So kind of take it with a pinch of salt, but the general premise is the same no matter how much your brand is making. So, why does that matter? Well, A, you're wasting money, and B, it's just showing kind of a lack of effectiveness. If you think about kind of having to spend 10 mil more a year on advertising, that to me just screams that your ads aren't efficient. And these are brands that when you look these are campaigns that when you look in platform, so if you're looking in Meta, for instance, might look really effective. You might think, oh, the ROAS is pretty healthy on those APSC shopping campaigns that we've got. I think we're doing all right. But then if you look at it and say, well, if we sideline some of that budget for brand building, how much more effective could those campaigns be? And it's looking beyond what we see in native platform analytics, and it's looking at everything more holistically. And you might be thinking, well, surely ads don't need to be exciting all the time, and they don't. But there needs to be something in there that sparks a little bit of emotion. Humor is generally the go-to emotion for most brands when we think of something that's emotionally driven, but it doesn't need to be. And especially for luxury, we see a lot of people leaning towards desire and aspiration as that kind of motivation. It doesn't need to be humorous, doesn't need to be avant-garde or out of the box. It just needs to capture somebody's attention and not be, a picture of a dress on a model with no head, because she won't fit in the frame. So think about that. And as you say, retail is the top industry for wastage. So I think it's an interesting stat when you think about it like that. And with that in mind, this is something we talk about a lot. And Andy touched upon it earlier in terms of that brand activity being a tool in reducing price sensitivity for your products. So when we think like we have a revenue target to meet and there's three weeks left in the quarter, what do brands do when they're in a panic? They promote discounts. If brands are struggling to acquire new customers, what do? They give people introductory discounts. And that's all well and good. But cognitively, you could then be devaluing your products. So instead of a product being worth £1,000 and selling it at £1,000 all the time, you're going, well, it is worth £1,000, but we'll give it to you 20% off. And slowly it just starts to depreciate in value because you think actually it's not worth 1,000, it's worth 800. And investing in that brand building, spending a little bit more time and potentially money on that piece that Andy said about really kind of talking through that story and building the narrative, building the community, saying this is the problem that we solve with our products. And in order to solve that product, it's going to cost you this much and not a penny less. You then begin to build this kind of reputation that your products are quality and they're worth that amount of money. This is also particularly important because the British Retail Consortium did a big survey of retailers, and 2/3 of those retailers are planning to raise their product prices to stay in line with national insurance increases. So as national insurance increases, this is in the UK, 2/3 of retailers are then going to increase their product prices in line with that. Now, are consumers going to be happy about that? Probably not, because they don't, or especially for luxury, people are already starting to have conversations about, are prices becoming a little bit too unreasonable in the luxury space. And I know that Vogue Business and Drapers have both written reports on this type of conversation that's happening with luxury consumers. So then increasing those products even more, is that going to help? In the US, there's talks about tariff increases with the new President Trump coming in with new mandates about tariffs. Is that going to increase the cost of goods? Is that going to increase your exporting costs, your importing costs? Costs of labor, costs of things being made overseas and shipped into the US. There's all of these different parameters that are potentially going to make products more expensive. So the most effective thing you can do as a brand is just reduce your reliance on promotions or reduce that price sensitivity with consumers. So you can say, yeah, we've had to increase our costs by 10%, but this is the extra 10% of value you're going to get. There's conversations in the US about more things being made within the US. So rather than things getting made in China or in Europe, keeping things in the US. Well, that's going to save on carbon emissions. It's going to be more sustainable because we're not shipping things overseas in freights. You could say that things are being locally sourced, and that in itself adds value to the product. So it's thinking about what story can we tell that's going to increase the value in line with the price of the product. So something that's quite timely, but that we do constantly need to be thinking about, and something we work hard with our clients on in terms of reducing that reliance on promotions to gain new customers, because it affects their lifetime value. And it might be that they can only afford your product when it's discounted, in which case they're a great customer to have, but they're only ever going to buy from you if you're running a sale. So their lifetime value decreases. And what we want is new customers that are always going to buy at full price, where your project profit margins are the healthiest. That builds your business.
Also, just a quick thing to add in there as well, is that based on price sensitivity, the story that delivers the sort of brand message within the story should be a bit like a personality, and it should detract people as much as it attracts, or detract even more people than it attracts. And that then feeds into price sensitivity, because if your brand and the story that you're delivering your brand through is targeting the right people and engaging the right people with that story, price sensitivity becomes less of an issue, because you know who you're targeting. They've got the money, they get it, they're the right people. Conversion rate should be higher, price sensitivity should be less. So again, another thing to think about is that I think in this day and age, we try and be all things to all people, whereas actually what we should try and do is really bring into our world the people that are right for us, both as a brand and also personally, of course, when we're trying to build friendships and whatever. So yeah, just something to think about.
Yeah, and I think the three brands that you mentioned at the very start, Andy, is a really good example of that. I remember when the first iPhone came out. I'm showing my age now. I remember when the first iPhone came out, it was, probably £500-600, which in those days was seen as quite expensive for a phone. The new iPhones are retailing at near £2,000 potentially. And yes, technology's increased and the specs of those phones are higher, but people will still pay that price because they see the value in having a brand new iPhone. Gymshark costs have increased, rightly so, as their manufacturing has increased and the quality of the garments has increased. Better fabrics, better wear and tear. People see the value in buying those products. You used to be able to buy a pair of Nike trainers for 30-40 quid, and now you'd be lucky to get one under 80, because people are still willing to invest that money because they know the brand, they trust the brand. It's something that our colleague David talks about a lot in terms of knowing them, liking them, trusting them. So I think that's something to aspire to. You want people to be able to be loyal no matter how much your products cost. And then when you do run a sale, it's as a reward to those customers, going, you are really loyal, and to celebrate that, we're going to give you this discount. And it might just be that you've got loads of old stock that you need to get rid of. They don't need to know that. They think that they're getting rewarded for being a loyal customer. And that's the way to tactically use sales for your benefit and to reward the customers that you already have, that you know are going to pay full price. And with that in mind, we have a couple of success stories for where we've implemented this level of storytelling. And the first is Ancient Greek Sandals. So they're a seasonal brand selling artisanal sandals, handmade in Greece. And we achieved a 77% increase in annual revenue. And they aren't small numbers either. They turn over a fair amount. So 77% increase is huge for them. And they're now selling across 63 countries globally. Whereas previously it was very much Europe that they were selling in and shipping to. And that was through strategies of introducing the brand in those newer countries via storytelling, and being able to kind of showcase why the products are special and why people should invest their money in buying those particular products. And then we've seen that then has a knock-on effect to the rest of the funnel, haven't we, Andy?
Absolutely.
And also luxury travel accessory brand Globetrotter. They're a heritage brand. They've been around since 1857. I think that might be wrong.
Right.
But they've been around for over 100 years. And we implemented a heritage-led campaign through Meta, talking about the history of the brand, and we achieved 15 times ROAS in 2 weeks. We also then introduced a new route to market for them. So we were able to start selling through a channel that historically they'd had no success with, because we adapted the way that the ads were structured. We adapted the story and the messaging to make them appeal to the people using that particular platform. And again, we've been able to sell in countries that historically we hadn't seen success in, and it's had a long-term effect on the performance of the brand digitally. For a brand that's, most of the success has come through bricks and mortar stores and offline selling. So, we know what we're talking about. We know that it works. It takes a little bit of time and a little bit of care to get the story right. But once you get it right, it just has a massive effect on the strategy as a whole, and not just those individual channels. Now we've come to the end. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but anyone that has left a question, we will come back to you. Andy, do you have anything else to add as we finish up?
No, just that the next sort of 5 webinars are going to really go into a lot more detail. So this is more of a, as you said at the start, Danielle, a bit more of a scene setting, talking a bit about the sort of general concept of storytelling and why it's so important. And then we're going to get into a bit more detail of how you can implement that over the next 5 months.
Yes, so tune in next month as we talk about how to find your brand story and ways that you can go about doing that. So that's going to be really interesting to be able to show our process in terms of how we really nail down a brand story. So useful for any brand side marketers, e-commerce directors that need some support in being able to really ideate different brand stories. So that's one not to miss. Thanks everyone for joining, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Andy.